Hello and Happy New Year. I'm trying something a little different with First Chapter Friday. I'm going to make it more like Book Talks, Friday Book Talks. I have to come up with a good name. Maybe some of you have some good ideas, but I wanted to share some of the books that I read while I was on break and just give you more like book talks and little summaries of the books so that you could decide if you wanted to read them yourself. So the first one that I read is called Orbiting Jupiter by Gary Schmidt. And this is a pretty quick read. It is a book that was written a while ago, it's not a recent book. And it's just like a really compelling story that I think a lot of people would really enjoy. It's not really a happy story, but it has a really, I would say, satisfying ending. So this one's about a kid who's growing up on a farm with his family, and they decide to take in a foster kid. And so this one actually, the first few couple of pages really lays out the story really well. So I'm going to read to you just the first couple of pages, not the whole first chapter. Before you agree to have Joseph come live with you, Mrs. Stroud said, there are one or two things you ought to understand. She took out a Maine Department of Health and Human Services folder. Oh, this one takes place in Maine, and laid it on the kitchen table. My mother looked at me for a long time. Then she looked at my father. He put his hand on my back. Jack should know what he's getting into, same as us, he said. He looked down at me, maybe you more than anyone. My mother nodded, and Mrs. Stroud opened the folder. This is what she told us. 2 months ago, when Joseph was at Adams Lake Juvenile, a kid gave him something bad in the boys' bathroom. He went into a stall and swallowed it. After a long time, his teacher came looking for him. When she found him, he screamed. She said he'd better come out of that stall right now. He screamed again. She said he'd better come out of that stall right now unless he wanted some more trouble. So he did. Then he tried to kill her. They sent Joseph to Stone Mountain, even though he did what he did because the kid gave him something bad and he swallowed it. But that didn't matter. They sent him to Stone Mountain anyway. He won't talk about what happened to him there, but since he left Stone Mountain, he won't wear anything orange. He won't let anyone stand behind him. He won't let anyone touch him. He won't go into rooms that are too small, and he won't eat canned peaches. He's not very big on meatloaf either, said Mrs. Stroud, and she closed the State of Maine Department of Health and Human Services folder. He'll eat my mother's canned peaches, I said. Mrs. Stroud smiled. We'll see, she said. Then she put her hand on mine. Jack, your parents know this, and you should too. There's something else about Joseph. What? I said. He has a daughter. I felt my father's hand against my back. She's almost 3 months old, but he's never even seen her. That's one of the biggest heartbreaks in this case. Mrs. Stroud handed the folder to my mother. Mrs. Hurd, I'll leave you with this. Read it and let me know what you decide. Call me in a few days and we've talked this over, said my mother. We already know. Are you sure? My mother nodded. We're sure, my father said. Mrs. Stroud looked at me. How about you, Jack? My father's hand still against my back. How soon can he come? I said. So the other main character, Jack is the main character, but then the other main character, Joseph, in this book, is in 8th grade. So this one was, like I said, a very compelling story. Another one that I read that I really enjoyed is called Louder Than Hunger. This one is by John Schu. This one is a novel in verse, as you have probably seen this kind of book before. And it is it's kind of a memoir because it is based on the author's lived experience, except a bunch of the characters are fictionalized, and the way things kind of go in the book are a little different from his story. So we're calling it a fiction story, but it's based very, very heavily on his own story of being a middle school boy who has an eating disorder and has to go to a facility to try to help him get over his eating disorder. And I found this book also like a little bit hard to read, but sometimes I find that reading books like that just helps me understand things and people and human beings out in the world. Everybody has their struggles. You don't actually hear a lot about you don't see a lot of books that are written about boys that have eating disorders. There are a lot of books written about girls with eating disorders because it's a little more common, but boys definitely have them too. And this book, across the board, is pretty authentic in terms of somebody dealing with that issue because it is his, based so heavily on his lived experience. So This one is also a book that I highly recommend. The next book I want to talk about is called Westfallen, and this is by a brother-sister writing duo, Anne Brashares and Ben Brashares. And this is kind of like I'm still not sure exactly where to put this one, historical fiction or science fiction, because it has an element of sort of time travel, parallel universe going on, which is just like one of my favorite things to read in books. And so this is about uh, six kids, three of them in 1944 and three of them in 2023. And they somehow, I'm not going to tell you too much about it because you got to read the book, but they find a way to communicate with each other. And then they have to decide exactly how much are they going to tell each other and exactly how much are they going to be do because they're worried about altering the future. And so I'm just going to read you the very, very intro of this because it's kind of compelling and it might make you want to read the story. Let me ask you this. What's the worst thing you've ever done? Really think about it. Well, multiply your thing by 1,000,000,000 and you don't even come close to mine. Sorry to brag, it's just your thing. It's the Cheeto dust thumbprint you left on the basement sofa. It's an ant's toe you stepped on, and then you said, sorry, and the ant went, no worries, mate, because the ant's British. I don't know. My name's Henry Platt, and I'm 12 years old. I say it's my thing, but I can't really take all the credit. There were others, 6 of us to be exact. We each had a role to play, all guilty, but it started with me, a decision I made, and for that, I guess I'm the guiltiest. Again, it's not a competition. But if it were, I'd win. Woohoo. So why am I telling you this? I mean, if it's so horrible, wouldn't I want to keep it a secret? Normally, yes, but where we are now is so very, very far from normal. We've done everything we can to fix the mess we've made. In a few hours, we'll see if it worked. These words I'm writing now, they're like our trail of breadcrumbs. Because if somehow this doesn't go right, we need you, reader, to know what really happened. BTW, Frances just read this over my shoulder and said my breadcrumbs suck and to do better. She's always been really supportive like that. If all goes well, you'll never know about us. Life here in 21st century America will seem normal to you. Nazi Germany will stay in the history books. You'll never know about Nazi America, or Westfallen as it's called. The only evidence you'll have of what we did will be these pages you're reading right now. If not, bitte vergib uns, which there's a little footnote and it says, please forgive us. So hopefully I pronounced that German correctly. I couldn't put this book down. It was really, really interesting. It's also funny. The characters are terrific. And I think it's one that you'll really, really like. And the last one that I want to talk about is one I haven't finished reading yet. It's called Black Star by Kwame Alexander. So Kwame Alexander is the same person who wrote The Crossover and booked in a whole bunch of different kind of sports books. But he also wrote a book called The Door of No Return. And all of his books are novels in verse. This one's historical fiction, just like The Door of No Return. So The Door of No Return was the first book in a trilogy, and this is the second one. And the first book took place in Africa during the period when Africans were being stolen from their homelands and brought to America and enslaved. So it's about kind of how that happened on the Africa side. This book is now generations in the future from there during the sort of civil rights era, and it's about a young black woman a girl, who really wants to be a baseball player. But at that time, it's pretty hard for black folks to be baseball players, let alone a girl. So there are ties in this story to The Door of No Return. But if you wanted to just read one or the other, you could. They don't necessarily have to be read, one after another, but it does help make the story a little more interesting. So because there are connections and you'll see those connections, and I think that's kind of important. So anyway, this is so far really grabbing me. Kwame Alexander, fantastic author. And so if you would like to check out any of these books or any other books, please come to our library.